Hello, we will begin in 2 minutes. In approximately 2 minutes, we're just waiting for people to log on. Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening for those who are in St. Petersburg in Russia. My name is Ekaterina Pravilo. I'm professor of history at Princeton University, and I'm very happy to start this lecture series organized by Princeton, Pierce, and the European University in St. Petersburg in Russia. Let me start with just introducing my colleagues, my co-organizers, Professor Basil Baudet from Department of Art and Archaeology at Princeton, and Professor Katrin Phillips from European University at St. Petersburg. Professor Phillips will open the series today with her talk, How to be a European Collecting Drawings in Imperial Russia. But before we begin, let me just say a few words about this project and about this collaboration. The initial impetus for this project was an idea to introduce the magnificent collections of art in Russian museums and galleries to international scholarly audience. So it's silver lining to this cloud of our life during COVID-19, as we can make it happen without traveling across the Atlantic. And at the same time, as we are historians, the historians of art, we wanted to study the emergence of these collections, the phenomenon of art collecting from cultural, historical, and anthropological perspectives. We want to explore how Russia and Russians, starting from the 18th century, reimagined their country and expressed it through their collection of paintings, graphics, and icons. In this lecture, speakers will talk about the ideologies and practicing of acquiring, classifying, and displaying art. The lectures will address the role of art collecting in shaping Russian national art, as well as Russia's place in the world. Our first speaker today is Professor Katrin Phillips, as I mentioned she's a Vladimir Levinson Lesson Professor of the History of Collecting at the European University at St. Petersburg in Russia. She has collaborated on academic research and publishing project with the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg since 1994. She is specializing on the circulation and collecting of old master drawings. Currently, Professor Phillips is working on a catalog of the founding collection of drawings in the Hermitage Museum bought by Catherine the Great in 1768. It forms the heart of what is now a world-renowned cabinet of drawings. with a research student at the European University in St. Petersburg. She's working to create a database of information about collecting in Russia up to the revolution in 1917. So we start in a few seconds, but let me just remind you that we will, Katrin Phillips will talk for about an hour. And then after that, we will collect questions through the Q&A function on Zoom. If you have any technical questions, you can use the chat, and either me or Professor Bade will respond to these issues. Please, Professor Phillips.
Yes, good evening in St. Petersburg, good day, good afternoon. I'm very honoured to be opening this series of lectures. It is an honour, and in many ways it's perhaps good that I'm coming first, because after me, the people who follow me in this series of lectures are such wonderful historians of collecting, and I'd rather go before them than after them. So my subject is how to be a European, collecting drawings in Imperial Russia. And you see here this frontispiece from a sales catalogue from 1744, a sale that took place in Paris. And it is this image that is the epitome of the Parisian collector of around the 1740s. Gentlemen looking through prints and drawings, admiring paintings on the walls, showing their refined tastes and sensibilities, and associating with each other, using art as a means of communication. And it is this that I'm going to talk about, of how that is transferred, or how it is not transferred, to Russia in the 18th century. So the image that you have seen on the poster for these lectures is in fact the drawings, the gallery of drawings in the Imperial Hermitage Museum, as it was in 1859. And I should say here that I was very lazy in labelling my images, so all works of art are in the Hermitage Museum unless I've put a different location for them. So this is in the Hermitage. It's one of a series of watercolours that was produced of the interiors of the museum, but also of the palace, because we have to understand that in the second half of the 19th century, the museum was a museum, but it was attached to the Winter Palace, and it was part of the imperial complex of buildings. So in 1852, Nicholas I, I do apologize, had opened the Imperial Hermitage Museum. We say to the public, it was a very limited public, not everybody could come in, but even so, there was access to works of art displayed as art rather than in private rooms. These rooms were specifically created for display. And not immediately, but within 5 years, we see the first display of drawings, which is what you see here, 80 drawings in frames, and more. If you look carefully, you can see more drawings in the cases, lying down, and even in a vertical cabinet on the right-hand side, they're sort of stuck inside the glass. So it's not what we would think of today as a way to display drawings, and one might think that this room wasn't perfectly designed to display drawings, but that isn't what it was created for. It was created to house sculpture, and it was the change in about 1857 that put these on display. And then there was more changes, more acquisitions of drawings, and a few years later, in a totally different space, there was a new display with nearly 550 drawings in frames. And that display remains in place until 1915. And one of the lovely things about this drawing is that you can identify the drawings that were on display. So we have a catalogue which does help, but you can also see they're quite recognizable. These are not perhaps the best of the drawings, but they were the ones that you can see on the left. And from this display of the drawings, you might think that drawings were central to the imperial hermitage, to the imperial concept of a museum. But in fact, if we look at these drawings, nearly all of the drawings that were on display, certainly nearly all of those that were on display in 1857, had come from one collection purchased by Catherine the Great in 1768. So it's the founding collection of the Hermitage, which is that of this man you see here, Charles Cobenzl. Catherine had bought her first collection of paintings in 1764, 317 pictures. And this was a bit of taking paintings from him because he owed her money, but also because being a collector as a monarch was really quite important, and having paintings for a palace that was only recently completed and in fact that was already being extended. But in 1768, she buys this collection of just a few paintings, 46 paintings, and over 4,000 drawings. So just to give you some idea of the significance of that collection until the revolution, until 1917, a 1797 inventory compiled lists just 6,800 drawings. 60% of them were from Cobenzl. Of the 80 drawings on display in the first display, 79 came from that collection. And even when that display was expanded to nearly 550, 373 of them came from this founding collection. So what we're seeing in the 1850s and 60s is a collection that was acquired 100 years before. And we can tell that then not many additions had been made. Additions had been made, but they were not considered to be those that should go on display as part of the permanent display. And I should also say that the choice of drawings that was on display in the 19th century, as a number of critics pointed out, were not those that we would choose today. So drawings that we prize today were not those that were prized then. Nonetheless, this very high proportion of drawings come from this founding collection. And one of the reasons is that Catherine, she did acquire more drawings, but not many, and with no enthusiasm. So if we look at two drawings that come from that very first founding collection, this lovely design for a relief by the sculptor Baccio Bandinelli and a Hendrik Golds's courtesan, this is the kind of drawing that Catherine did not particularly like. She had no interest in. She loved architectural fantasies and topographical drawings like we see below. And in fact, there are two wonderful quotations that make this clear. In the same year, as if she were providing us with material, she told us exactly how she felt about these two different kinds of material. The architectural drawing, and the architectural fantasy, she says of the artist Clérisseau, for several days I filled all my leisure hours contemplating the drawings of Clérisseau, and my head burns, for one's head burns when it finds things which set fire to the imagination. The fermentation caused by Clérisseau's drawings is immense. So she hung his drawings under glass in her boudoir. Meanwhile, that same year, her agents in Rome were offering her the contents of the studio of the renowned painter Anton Raphael Mengs, who had recently died, with all his sketches, which are now so highly prized. And they were sent to her, and she said, "These are just the kind of drawings for which I have absolutely no desire. They're filled with figures of animals and human figures and ornaments of the kind you see everywhere. And so I've ordered them to be sent back." And one wonders why, if this was her attitude to drawings, to the kind of drawings that we think of as old master drawings, not those very finished architectural drawings. What was it that prompted her in 1768 to purchase a collection that was made up exclusively of figures of animals and human figures and ornaments? And this is where we come to this question of the European collector, the image of the European connoisseur. And in the 18th century, drawings become part of what we now call a discourse of distinction, how to stand out from the crowd. Because increasingly there were anybody who made their name or made a bit of money, who wanted to assert their status, they were increasingly forming collections of some kind. And it became very difficult to stand out from the crowd. And collecting drawings was something that was done not only because people had a preference for drawings or a liking for drawings, but also because it became one of the ways to assert that you were more penetrating, more perspicacious than the other collectors around you. And in France, we find one of the first references to this idea that drawings offer greater intellectual opportunity. They require more of the viewer. Dates from the text of Roger de Pile at the end of the 17th century, in which he tells us bluntly, drawings provide those who love them with greater opportunities to exercise their critical faculties. They show more of the master's character. In the drawing, the painter abandons himself to his genius and shows himself as he really is. There are very few admirers of drawings, and amongst them even fewer who understand the finer points. Demi-connoisseurs have no passion for this sphere of curiosity, since unable to sufficiently penetrate the spirit of drawings, they cannot taste all the pleasures. So this is a very polite put down to those who don't understand drawings, and an assertion of a superiority for those who do. And although Roger de Pile used the term demi-connoisseur, as the century advanced in Paris, we find this argument, this conflict, as people try to assert themselves as belonging to the more penetrating group of people, the people who have greater understanding. And then we find the terms curieux and amateur. So curiosité is an interest in artistic objects or curious objects or works of art and science. And so those who have a collection or are interested in a bit of this and a bit of that, they are mere curieux. And true people, people who have a penetrating eye, people who understand the intellectual essence, they are true amateurs or connoisseurs. And it has nothing to do with the way that we use the word amateur today. So then in the context of Paris in the middle of the 18th century, the amateur was somebody who really understood, somebody quite superior to the common class of collectors out there. I have to say, not just because I'm British, this whole idea of drawings being closer to the artist, offering you more access to the artist's intentions, to their spirit, it doesn't just date from Roger de Pile. We find 1638, Franciscus Junius, who was the librarian to Britain's great collector, the Earl of Arundel, who had a most amazing collection of drawings that was then dispersed. We see the same things in his text on the painting of the ancients. And Roger North, who was a very close friend of Sir Peter Lely. Although he wasn't British, we consider him British because his career unfolded in Britain, and he was one of the great collectors of drawings in Britain in the 17th century. And again, we see that drawings have more of the spirit and force of art than finished paintings, that an artist's flow of fancy is wiped out with the paintbrush. So the drawing brings you closer to the artist. And all these ideas come to a head in the 18th century, and the best expression, there are two texts. One is Joseph-Antoine Desalliés d'Argentville, who wrote advice for what we might call the curieux, for the man who wanted a bit of this and a bit of that, a letter on the choice and arrangement of a collector's cabinet. And he again asserts this sphere of curiosité demands far greater knowledge than prints. And in 1744, in the very catalogue in which we see this image of the Parisian collectors, the Parisian amateurs and connoisseurs admiring works on paper and paintings, the author, Edmé Gersin, says there are few specialists in drawings. This particular kind of curiosity is difficult to master and usually strikes only those who've acquired sufficient knowledge to appreciate all its beauties. So drawings are part, as I say, of this discourse of distinction. And one of the most famous French Parisian collectors of drawings is Pierre Crozar. And one of the reasons why I mention him is because if we're talking about collecting art in Russia and we're talking about the Hermitage, we have to mention him because he had 400 paintings, which were divided amongst his heirs, but about half of them made their way to the Hermitage when his nephew died in 1770, and in 1772 they were bought by Catherine, and you see two of the great Danaïs from the Crozar collection by Titian and Rembrandt, and Antoine Watteau with the actors of the Comédie Française, and these arrived in 1772 when they were bought from his nephew. He also owned engraved gems, and although they were bought on his death by the Duke d'Orléans, when later on the whole of the Orléans collection was purchased by Catherine the Great, and they ended up in the Hermitage. As for the drawings, there were over 19,000 of them sold in Paris in 1741, and dozens of them have arrived in the Hermitage from a variety of sources between 1768 and 1940. First, however, I'm going to very quickly show you a drawing that arrived as a painting. This drawing is going to be the subject of a lecture by Alexei Larionov in November, and he's going to talk about it in great detail and show you some of its incredible beauty. It arrived as a painting, as I say. It is on canvas, it's in pen on canvas, and as you can see, it is immense. So it couldn't possibly be kept as part of a drawings cabinet. And this came from Crozar, but it also had an amazing history in that it was presumably created for Rudolph II, Holy Roman Emperor, and then it was owned by Queen Christine of Sweden, a very famous collector, and Cardinal Mazarin, and then Pierre Crozar, and then Catherine II. So it has this incredible provenance, as well as being one of the most outstanding works you will ever see in your life. But there were other drawings that came as drawings. And from that first collection in 1768 come these two drawings, for instance. So these were owned by Cobenzl. The parade horse on the left, the Italian drawing, which was sold from the Hermitage in 1931 and is now in Cleveland. And the drawing on the right by Abraham van Diepenbeck showing St. Cecilia and Valerian, they both come from the Crozar collection. But there are plenty of other drawings. For instance, this very small drawing on the left, formerly given to Rembrandt and now attributed to Willem Drost, and this design for a printer's mark by Peter Paul Rubens. And what's one of the ways that we can tell that these drawings came from Crozar is that they have marks on them. So just a quick word about collector's marks, because that Crozar provenance was very important, because Pierre Crozar was so well known as a connoisseur, so well known as somebody who had taste and the works of art he owned were of the highest quality, largely speaking. The fact that drawings had belonged to him gave them particular cachet later in years. And so sometimes collectors' marks were put on drawings to indicate, during the collector's lifetime, to indicate that it was theirs. Sometimes marks were put on later on. So on these drawings here, you see several marks. Firstly, you see this Russian P, and this is the mark that was put on all the drawings in the collection by Catherine the Great's son in 1797, when he ordered an inventory to be made. And then you see these numbers, bottom right, which I won't go into how we know, but there has been proved that these indicate that these drawings were in the Crozar sale in 1741. You can also see another mark on the bottom of the Rubens, which is a mark put on a whole group of drawings by Rubens by a collector in the 18th century. So these drawings, they're not just works of art in themselves, they also tell us their history through the things we can see on the front. So Catherine, by buying drawings, she was joining this intellectual elite. She wasn't just going to own paintings, because it becomes clear that just about everybody has paintings. She's also going to be owning a collection of more than 4,000 drawings. And she's not just joining an academic elite, an intellectual elite. She's joining a royal elite. And these three are here partly because I like the portraits of them. Augustus, the Third of Poland, Elector of Saxony, very famous collection of drawings in Dresden. George III became king in 1760, and in 1761, one of his first major cultural acts was to buy thousands of drawings from the collection of Consul Joseph Smith, and thereby lay the foundation for the famous royal collection of drawings in London. And Stanislav Poniatowski is a slightly different question, and he in some ways has much in common with Catherine. So his collection, he is now at Warsaw University. He was King of Poland. He was elected King of Poland in 1764. So he wasn't born to it. He had been a secretary, in fact, in St. Petersburg. And in the 1750s, he was the lover of Catherine the Great. And whilst studies have been made about the parallels in the collecting of Poniatowski and Catherine in terms of their engraved gems and their paintings, nobody has yet looked at this fact that they both became collectors of drawings, and one wonders, and one can only wonder, whether she was aware of the importance of drawings because Poniatowski, who had spent his life up to in his 20s in the West, whereas she left Western Europe at the age of 14 and had been in Russia thereafter at a court that there were no real practitioners of collecting of drawings, or really only limited collections of paintings or acquisitions of paintings to decorate palaces, to decorate homes. So he's also a good parallel, because we have to remember that Catherine the Great did not just come to the throne in the normal way. She had overthrown her husband in 1762. And not only had she overthrown her husband, but by rights she should have given the throne to her son, who was then he would have been a minor, but even so. There was also still living another pretender to the throne who had been the emperor for about 6 months in his very early days of his life, but had been deposed by her predecessor and locked up, Joann VI, and he was still alive at this point. So there were other people who could have claimed the throne. And Catherine, it was very important that she assert the fact that she was not only had the right to the throne, but that she was the right person to be on the throne. And you might question whether Poniatowski also starts forming collections because he is elected king and he needs to demonstrate that he has all the kingly skills that are required, although in fact arts take over with him, and there are many complaints that he pays more attention to the arts than to running the country. But so she's joining this royal elite of collectors, but you wonder how Catherine knew in 1768 to buy this collection, which was in Brussels, had been formed in Brussels by this Austrian minister. And we often talk about the people who in these early years were her assistants, her agents, in helping her to fulfill her cultural policies. But it isn't clear, we don't know what the conversations were that they had. We don't know what they said to her. Ivan Shuvalov, whom you see here, had never been to the West. Although he was a great Francophile, spoke perfect French, he had never at this point been, when she came to the throne, he had never been abroad. He was only went abroad for the first time after she became empress. Dmitry Alexeyevich Golitsyn, who was a very important agent in acquisitions, including the acquisition of the drawings in 1768. But he was very young and very junior, and I think she was hardly likely to be being advised by him. And it seems to me that there's good evidence for us to look to two people who were extremely European. They were Russians, but they were extremely European in their history and their outlook. And that's the two men in the middle, Dmitry Mikhailovich Golitsyn and Ivan Ivanovich Bitskoy. And they're not just chance, just two people I've picked out by chance. They were related. So Ivan Bitskoy was uncle to the wife of Dmitry Golitzen. Ivan Bitskoy had been brought up in Sweden, in Paris. He'd spent much of his life abroad. His niece, Ekaterina, or Smaragda Kantemir as she was, she'd spent most of her life traveling in Europe with her mother and her stepfather. And it was only after her stepfather died, she and her mother returned to Russia, and she married Dmitry Mikhailovich Golitsyn. But she was quite ill in herself, and in 1755-56, the three of them, Betskoy, his niece and his niece's husband, set off to take the waters in Italy and then to live in Paris, to see doctors there in the hope of doing something to improve her health. So they spend the next 5 years there, and Alexander Mikhailovich Golitsyn, who is a cousin to Dmitry Mikhailovich, is based in Paris and London and is to be key to making the acquisitions in Russia when Catherine starts collecting. So these two men, they're in Paris at the height of the passion for the collection for drawings. But not only that, apart from Catherine's acquisition of drawings, these are the only two Russians that we know who before the 18th century have anything to do with old master drawings. Literally, I have not yet identified any others, not until the very end of the century. So Dmitry Mikhailovich Golitsyn, who was the Russian ambassador to Vienna, it says 1761 here, it should say 1762 because he didn't actually go until 1762. He was a patron of Mozart. He's mentioned in Mozart's letters all the time. He had a collection of paintings, but he also formed a collection of 4,100 drawings. Now, in Vienna at this time, where he was based, nobody collected drawings. It was like in St. Petersburg. It simply was not one of those things that people were doing. So he must have looked really quite unusual. And amongst the things he owned were drawings by Pompeo Batoni, Piranesi, a copy after Rembrandt then thought to be the original, and perhaps the most important was a little book of drawings which were then thought to be Hans Holbein's original sketches for his Dance of Death series, but in fact have since been shown to be drawings after Holbein by Rubens, aged just 12 or 13. So this is a precious little book that was owned by Dmitry Golitzen. So Ivan Bitskoy also has a connection with drawings, can be proved to have a connection with drawings. But I think that I'd like to look at this portrait because it says to me an awful lot about how Parisian Bitskoy was in the 1750s and early 1760s. In 1762, yes, Bitskoy is summoned back to St. Petersburg by Catherine the Great's husband, still on the throne, not yet been overthrown, to take charge of public buildings. And once Peter III has been killed, accidentally of course, and Catherine comes to the throne, he's given increasing control of all aspects of the arts, of building, of education, and he draws up plans for education institutions, to set up a foundling hospital, to set up a school for young ladies, and he becomes the president of the Imperial Academy of Arts in St. Petersburg. And this painting by the Swedish painter, Alexander Roslin, was painted in Paris. So it must have been painted about 1762, when just before Bitskoy, we know that Bitskoy went to Paris before going, just after Catherine came to the throne. But I think this comparison with this very French portrait on the right by Greuze of the amateur Claude Watelet is very telling, although Betskoy is looking, in fact, at a print of a picture of his sister who had died by this time, and he's not looking at arts or such like. Still, it is the same image of that. It's a very un-Russian image. It's a very Parisian image. And his involvement with the arts can be demonstrated quite clearly, and there are numerous references to his involvement in the arts on all levels. The Marquis de Beausset was quite polite in saying that he has a taste for the arts and is a genius for buildings and gardens. And it shows you how close he was thought to be to the Empress. Sabatier de Cabre, a man who disliked him intensely, was very dismissive and says he has as little credit in grand affairs as he has absolute control of those frivolous little departments of which he has charge, such as the Corps de Cadets, the Smolny Institute for Young Ladies, the arts buildings, and so on. So even Sabatier de Cabre, who dismisses what he does, recognizes that he is in charge of the arts. And if we look at the 1750s, we find Betskoy everywhere. He is in Paris. He is attending the salon of Madame Geoffrin. He is one of 30 select connoisseurs presented with this collection of drawings after ancient paintings that was published in that year. We find a print after a painting thought to be by Poussin. In fact, it's by Spierings, but it was engraved as the work of Poussin with a dedication to Betskoy. And it's with these Parisian ideas that Betskoy comes back to Russia. These European ideas about, he's seen what happening in Paris. He's seen the royal collection of drawings there that's existed since the 17th century. And when Catherine becomes empress, he, in charge of the arts already, essentially, comes up with a plan for monumental propaganda. As I said, she has taken the throne. She needs to demonstrate that she is the right person to be on that throne. And he comes up with the idea of having a series of paintings that would be like the life of Marie de Medici by Rubens, that hung in the Luxembourg Palace in Paris. And it had very recently become open to the public. There'd been much demand to open the royal collection to the public. And in 1750, the Luxembourg Palace was opened and these paintings were on display. And Betskoy specifically refers to this series as a sort of a model for a series like this for Catherine the Great. Catherine is not very happy at this idea because she's only just taken the throne, so she can hardly celebrate her achievements. And nor was she particularly taken, so it seems, by his idea that there should be an equestrian monument of Catherine. Again, looking to the equestrian monuments that he had seen in Paris, which, as we know, were based on the, or harked back to the statue of Marcus Aurelius. And although that equestrian monument to Catherine was never created, this painting by Vigilius Eriksson, painted later 1762 to 1763, we see here the echo of those equestrian monuments. It is not a bronze, a large bronze, but in every way it harks to those monuments that were to Louis XIV, Louis XIII in Paris. And this painting is displayed in the Hermitage alongside these two carousel portraits of two of the men who helped bring Catherine to power, Grigory Orlov on the left, her lover, and Alexei Orlov, his brother, on the right, and they form this sort of triptych with this equestrian statue in the middle. And you can see the comparison between her horse and its static, statue-like quality and the prancing horses of the two brothers. So Betskoy is responsible for bringing to Russia a large collection of drawings, even larger than the Cobenzl collection that Catherine buys in 1768, and even before that collection was bought. In January 1767, he is responsible for handing over nearly 6,800 drawings to the Academy of Arts, of which he is president. They are today partly in the Hermitage, partly still in the Academy. These are some of the ones that are in the Hermitage, the only confirmed drawing by Rembrandt, this wonderful Jacques Belange. And these drawings, they have a little mark. If we're looking at collector's marks, you can see this. These drawings that were presented in 1767 all have this mark on them. Now, Alexei Larionov, who is going to talk to you in November, he has suggested that this wasn't really a collection, that the order was given to buy these drawings on the market in order to provide students at the Academy with material. And that seems very, very likely that that was the case. Nonetheless, a couple of months later, more drawings are bought for the Academy from the sale of Jean de Julien, a very famous drawings collector in Paris, another one, and which bought drawings by major artists. These again are some of those that are in the Hermitage. So we can see that that Betskoy is bringing drawings into the Academy, and that he has this interest. As I say, whether that first donation or that first presentation of drawings was his collection, we can certainly say that it came through Betskoy, that he has an understanding that the Academy needs drawings, that drawings are necessary. And then in 1769, he presents a further 363, I think, drawings. Catherine had bought this painting by Greuze in 1766. It had been a sensation at the Salon in Paris, and she bought it. And in 1769, Bitskoy hands over more drawings to the Academy by Greuze, and they include, it's quite by chance, or was it by chance? We find they're now all in the Hermitage, the studies by the artist for this drawing, this painting, and the painting itself. So these two men, they are the men who collect drawings, know about drawings, they understand the significance. They're very Parisian in their outlook, very European in their outlook. There is one other person who is going to help Catherine to buy drawings in 1773, although she does seem to ignore them. She buys 122 drawings at a sale in Amsterdam through Dmitry Golitsyn, who is a distant cousin, not closely related. And he himself forms a collection of about 800 Dutch and Flemish drawings whilst he's living in The Hague. But he is, as I say, very young, and he's more facilitating her purchase than advising. And I think it must be these, as I say, these two men who are demonstrating to her that a collection of drawings is de rigueur for any self-respecting monarch, any self-respecting intellectual. So what does she do with her drawings? This is a very quick show. You will see, I think Guillaume Nicou in the spring will be talking to you about Catherine's Hermitage in detail. And this just shows you roughly how it's laid out. So the Palais Impérial, that's the main winter palace. And then you have her small hermitage, and then the big hermitage and a theatre. And her art was concentrated mainly in the large hermitage at this point. And Catherine herself in 1790, so just 6 years before her death, she describes that her hermitage. And we have to say that she does know how many drawings she's got. It's not like she only remembers her architectural drawings. So she tells us that apart from the paintings and her Raphael lodges, she's got 38,000 books, 4 rooms filled with books and prints, 10,000 engraved gems, nearly 10,000 drawings, and so on. But importantly, the description of the drawings, published in a description of the Hermitage during her lifetime, only mentions the kind of drawings that Catherine liked: views of the Crimea and Herculaneum, drawings by Clericeau, Bibbiena, and other architects. So we very much understand that during Catherine's lifetime, those were what were prized. When she died, her art collections were catalogued by order of her son Paul, and that's when the letter P is put on them. You can see here, we know where in the large Hermitage she kept her drawings. It was in this room here, which was quite near her private rooms. But then on her death, her son has everything brought together and catalogued, and her grandson then has them put in a new catalogue made, a proper catalogue, much more efficient than the one done by Paul, and they're given inventory numbers. And quite interestingly, they still have the same inventory numbers today they were given in the period 1806 to 11, which is extremely unusual. But like Catherine, Catherine had sort of felt she'd got what she needed. She was an empress and she had a collection of drawings, and she didn't really feel the need to add. And the director of the Hermitage in the early 19th century reported to Alexander that he felt that it was quite adequate and that no effort should be made to increase the collection unless chance brings something forward. And that is literally what is going to happen more or less throughout the 19th century. If somebody walks in and says, I've got some drawings, then the drawings are bought. But otherwise, there is no effort to increase the collection. Under this new, more efficient arrangement, the drawings were moved up a floor into a formal space that was, instead of being Catherine's private rooms surrounded by works of art, it became a formal museum space where the works were on display. And they were now moved up a level together with the prints, and they were in a room surrounded by paintings. They weren't on display. In the 1840s, the collection formed by Dmitry Mikhailovich Golitsyn, one of those two men who was in Paris in the 1850s, having passed through the family, was put up for sale in Moscow. And it was very highly priced. It included, as I say, the Rubens after Holbein, then thought to be Holbein's originals, these lovely, a set of early 16th century German drawings, Simon Vouet, 4,000 drawings. So an attempt was made to try and sell them to the emperor, who was then building the new Hermitage. It was thought, well, you know, this is wonderful. This will be a superb edition. And he said no, although he asked for 2 references. He got 2 reviews of the collection from people who were his most trusted advisors. They both cautiously recommended the purchase, and Nicholas basically said, no, we have enough drawings, we don't need them. And these drawings were then sold abroad, which is why now you can find them across France and in Belgium. And I'm sure there are drawings elsewhere as well. So the Hermitage Museum opens in 1852. You can see the building on the left. And although there are more cars today, the building more or less looks like that. And this drawing shows you, when the museum opened, this first room. You can see the main entrance there at the portico. And just inside and on the right, Gallery 1, when the museum opened, was Russian sculpture. And you can see that room as it was there. And then in 1857, everything moves around and it becomes the drawings room. And as I've said, this is just a very short stay. It's there for 6 or 7 years. And then it moves again. And it moves, you can see, from just inside the entrance to this gallery that runs along the right-hand side, right next door to the prints department. And the view there is of the prints department, about which Roman Grigoriev of the Hermitage will be talking in the spring again, talking about collecting Rembrandt in Russia, Rembrandt prints in the 19th century. So it's moved into this immense space, and this is where the 547 drawings that go on show, this is where they're on show, in this gallery, extremely well lit, very bad for drawings, unfortunately, this was the view here was done before the drawings moved in, so this was when it was the fine arts gallery, but then cupboards were moved in to store the drawings, and the drawings were displayed between the windows on the window wall, and you can see the red line marks that gallery from the outside running along the Winter Canal. So this display has become almost written in stone now. From 1863 until 1950, essentially there are only minor changes as some temporary drawings go up, but the rest of them are more or less on permanent display, and very few additions are made of any kind. And it is this point that in Russia, the accent moves over to private collectors outside the imperial family. So the imperial family may have led the way in the form of Catherine the Great in collecting in the 18th century. And now the imperial family goes into what you might call the doldrums in terms of collecting, particularly collecting drawings. And it's individuals such as Nikolay Borisovich Yusupov, who has various palaces in Moscow and St. Petersburg. We don't actually know when he collected his drawings. Certainly not before the end of the 1780s. He died in 1831. All we know is that when the Yusupov collection was nationalized after the revolution, 2,500 drawings came to the Hermitage from the Yusupov collection. Unfortunately, we don't know which ones of those were collected by him and when, but we do know that at least the basis was laid by him. So he's really in the early 19th century, and he's one of the more often mentioned names of people collecting in Russia, collecting drawings. He was very European in his outlook, in his aspirations. And I think, again, with him, we can see him collecting drawings as a sort of a joining in with this European trend. The other collector who is often called a Russian collector is a Dutchman called Jan Pieter van Sukdelin, who was born in the Netherlands, but he joined the Russian service. You see him in his Russian army uniform on the right with all his Russian medals. But again, we don't know when he bought his drawings. He was at war for most of the time in the end of the 18th century, fighting Napoleon on the Russian side. And his life more or less settles down only into the 1810s. And he is sent off to Sweden as Russian ambassador. And his collection then goes to his son, and the drawings are sold off in 1862. We don't really know whether that collection ever spent much time in Russia. So to call him a Russian collector, I think, is slightly misleading. He was a European, he wasn't trying to be European. And the thing about those drawings is they come up all the time at market and on the market. And you can see I just took a random selection of 3 drawings that were on the market at one auction house in the last 5 years. So the Imperial Collection, as I say, is gaining more or less chance drawings, more of these architectural designs that were produced for the emperor, for new buildings going up in the city. The drawings were presented to the emperor. When the building was done, the drawing goes into the Hermitage. Or topographical views of parts of the Russian Empire, like we see in bottom left. In 1833, the collection of Pavel Divov was acquired, but it was mainly topographical drawings, and the non-topographical, like this Boucher, were just few and far between. So very, very few additions being made. And that idea that there was sufficient, that there was no need to add, continued until towards the end of the 19th century, when it suddenly became clear that there were private collectors in Russia who were forming collections, who knew about drawings, who were very European in their outlook, very often buying drawings in Europe and bringing them back to Russia. And the recognition that the Hermitage collection had been sort of frozen in time and that it was neglected was now understood, but nothing was being done about it, partly because of this lack of interest on the part of the emperor. In Moscow, however, the situation was very different. In Moscow, which felt very left out on the cultural scene because it had no art museum. There were private art galleries that occasionally opened to the public in the course of the 19th century, but there was no proper public art gallery until the Rumyantsev Museum was set up in 1862. And when the Golitsyn collection was on sale in the 1840s, there had been polemics on the pages of the newspapers about how the collection needed to be bought. They needed to set up a museum that would be used by students and artists to learn to become better artists, for connoisseurs to admire, but it all came to naught. And then in 1862, the Rumyantsev Museum is set up. And almost immediately, collectors start presenting it with drawings because they recognize there is no collection of drawings, that nothing is being added to the Imperial Collection. And that it is, in order to call this a truly European gallery, not just some local provincial gallery, it has to have not just paintings and sculptures, it has to have drawings. So we see just a purely arbitrary selection. This drawing from the school of Albrecht Dürer came from a gift to the Rumyantsev Museum from Konstantin Ryumin. It's now in the Pushkin Museum of Fine Arts. And Ivan Klachkov, who died in 1903, bequeathed his drawings to the Rumyantsev Museum. There were lots of Russian works, but also some Western European works. So here we see one of the Russian works. And Nikolay Maslov, now he is a big name. His father had been a collector, but mainly a collector of prints. Maslov collects Dutch drawings. He's obsessed by Dutch drawings. He just has this passion. He buys them wherever he can, mainly not on the market in Russia, because although some drawings are circulating, it's not that many. And one of the most loved drawings is, again, it's a drawing that's from the school of Rembrandt, but it doesn't matter, it's not by Rembrandt. It's a wonderful drawing of this old woman making pancakes at the fire. So he donated drawings to the museum and then bequeathed the rest of his drawings when he died. So what we're seeing is this stagnation in St. Petersburg, in the Hermitage, in a glorious building, but with little attention being paid. And in Moscow, private collectors starting to form collections of drawings in the second half of the 19th century and going out of their way to present them to a public museum, because it is so important that the self-respecting European museum should have drawings. In parallel to the Rumyantsev Museum, which was set up in 1862, we get, in 1912, the establishment of the Alexander III Museum of Fine Arts, which is now the Pushkin Museum of Fine Arts. And the very year it was set up, the nephew of the collector Sergei Pensky donated 101 drawings from his collection. So the very year of its foundation, somebody recognizes that it needs to have not just painting, but it must have drawings, that drawings are a key part of recognizing the value of a museum, the status of a museum. In St. Petersburg, outside the Hermitage itself, at this point, the collectors were very different. They weren't collecting at this point for the Imperial Museum, although the men who are named here, Alexandre Benoit, Prince Vladimir Argutinsky-Dolgorukov, and Stepan Yaremich, all worked or had things to do with the Hermitage after the revolution. And they all they all felt that the Hermitage collection of drawings was neglected, was not maintained. They wrote extremely critical articles. Stepan Yaremich was absolutely biting in what he said about the state of the collection. They all collected drawings. Benoit and Argutinsky-Dolgorukov were to emigrate to France in the 1920s. And you see here a charming picture of the prince by Alexandre Benoit in France in 1933. They were, although Yaremich was not from an elite family, they moved in the world of art movement, which was mainly much more aristocratic than the kind of wealthy industrialist, self-made men who were forming collections in Moscow. And they were forming collections, and in their collections after the revolution are going to form part of the Hermitage. Because what happens is, in 1917, we get the February Revolution, in which all the royal collections, the imperial collections, are frozen. They're going to become state property. And then in October 1917, we have the second revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, and everything changes. And we have the killing of the imperial family. Many people who wanted to stay initially, including Benoit and Algutinsky-Dolgorukov, they find a way to leave Russia. Algutinsky-Dolgorukov left his drawings, many of his drawings behind, although not all of them. And they are now to be found in the Hermitage and in the Russian Museum. Yaremich gave some drawings to the Hermitage and others were sold to the Hermitage. So they were to be absolutely key. And also, Alexandre Benoit was to be amongst those who helped to choose the drawings from private collections that were nationalized when they were brought into the Hermitage in the 1920s. So they were key. It was all these private collectors who were forming collections which then enter the national museums, the Museum of Fine Arts in Moscow, the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. And that's, as we said, so if you think that there were 14,100 drawings in the Hermitage as of 1918, there are now in excess of 40,000. Most of that difference, by far the greatest part of that difference, came from the nationalization of private collections after the revolution. Unfortunately, there were also some sales from the collection, and I just show three that are in the United States. The horse in Cleveland, very fine Federico Zuccaro, which is in the Pierpont Morgan Library, and this drawing that was in the collection of Robert Treat Paine in Boston, but I haven't tracked it down since the 1960s. So drawings came into the Hermitage, but also some drawings went out. Nonetheless, the collection that you see today in the Hermitage, or that I hope people will be able to see once it is possible to travel, is built around that collection acquired by Catherine the Great as part of this joining the club of elite intellectuals of a European standing. And today, this is what the drawings department looks like. This is where those drawings that you have seen are stored in this rather handsome room above. It's a gallery above the 12-column hall, and we look forward in the future to seeing you virtually at these lectures, but also in the Hermitage itself once it is possible for you to travel and see the works of art there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Catherine. This is marvelous, a marvelous lecture and a wonderful introduction to our lecture series. So I'm going to now read the questions, and let me remind the audience that first of all lectures will be recorded and then will be posted online, presumably on the website of Russian Center Program of Russian, East European and Eurasian Studies. And then please use the Q&A function. For those of you who are like me, new to Zoom, it's on the bottom, on the right side, on the bottom of the screen, the Q&A, and you can type your question and I will read it aloud to everyone. So let me begin with a question which was asked in the very beginning of your lecture from Nadine Orenstein. And you kind of partly answered it, but maybe there's something else that you can say. Who is selecting the works to be hung, and did Catherine have a curator?
So Catherine didn't, she hung drawings by Clerisot in her boudoir, that's all. She had a curator. I have to say that the curator of drawings in the 1790s was an architect, which is very telling about Catherine's tastes. In 1860, the head of the paintings, the head of the Western European art section, wrote a catalogue. He was very, not very knowledgeable. Gustav Wagen came and saw the drawings in 1863, I think, and was a bit sort of, oh, that's not really by him, you know, and that should change. So it was being chosen by this time it was being chosen by an official museum curator. But Catherine did not hang drawings except the architectural drawings she hung in her bedroom. You only really get a professional drawings curators after the revolution. I mean, the revolution did wonderful things for the drawings department, I have to say. It brought in truly knowledgeable people like Benoit, people like Argutinsky Bulgarukov, people like Yeremich, who at last sorted the drawings out, most of which had been there for more than 100 years without being sorted.
Yes, thank you, excellent. So there is another question from Basile Baudet. On Basile Baudet, he asking, do we know if the drawings were available on viewing by appointment before the opening of the museum to public? Do we know if the students of the Academy of Fine Arts consulted them, and maybe artists as well?
So artists were allowed to copy paintings. We know that. There are also, under Nicholas I, there are also records, documents in the archives that somebody has asked to borrow some drawings, some architectural drawings or some topographical views, and there's a record that's handed out and it's come back. Nicholas I himself often asked, but usually for topographical views or army uniforms. So not really the old master drawings. We don't really know. I haven't seen, it doesn't mean that there isn't any record, somebody saying, can I borrow the album of drawings by older masters? I don't think that many people really knew they were there, to be honest. They were in cabinets in that room in the 1830s. They were surrounded by paintings, and we know that they're there because the guidebook describes and says these are cabinets full of drawings, but it doesn't say that they're on display, and there is no description in the catalogue. So, but at the Academy, I can tell you, students were using drawings. They were using the drawings by Greuze and others as study material, and some of the drawings are in a very bad condition because they were used, which is why they were acquired.
Okay, thank you. We've got a few other questions from Rosalind Blakesley. To what extent did Catherine comment on issues of quality in her drawing collections as opposed to her regular fixation on measures of quantity?
Quality only worried her if it was Clerisot, if it was Galli-Bibbiena, if it was architectural drawings. She really, as I say, she didn't like the kind of old master drawings that she'd acquired in 1768. And in fact, the man who organized the sale in 1768 writes to Alexander Mikhailovich Golitsyn and says, Mr. Betskoy hasn't replied about my purchase. Nobody said anything. Did she not like them? And I think we have to admit that she really didn't like them. She just felt that she ought to have it. It was something you had to have. You could say you had it. Got that, done that, tick that list. She only gets excited by very high quality architectural drawings and prints. That's what really turns her on, what makes her head burn. Mm-hmm. Or ferments, that's what she says, fermentation, she calls it.
Another excellent question that somehow continues maybe this. Is it conceivable that Catherine developed her taste over time? And are there any sources, oops, I lost it, that tell us something about her ideas on Europe, her Europeanness, or ideas on European standards in art?
The drawing I showed, the miniature I showed of her, which was at the very beginning, where there was a portrait of the collector Cobenzl and a picture of her writing her nakaz, her instruction. That was her presenting herself as in Russian fur-edged costume, but as a very European ruler. She always wanted to balance her Europeanness against the purely Russian way. And this is why the instruction is written and never really approved, because there are certain things she just finds she can't do. And so she writes corresponds with Europeans. She buys Diderot's library. She writes to Voltaire. She asks him to come out. You know, she has statues of Voltaire. She buys statues of Voltaire. She has Falconet come to make a statue, and she talks to him and everything. But she realizes, particularly because she is not Russian, she realizes she has to tread that fine line between being within Russia, being Russian and European, and showing that she is doing things that people are doing in Russia. And I would put this on the same level, for instance, as the fact that she has her grandchildren vaccinated against smallpox. It is something that people were doing. Maria Theresa is having her family suffering from smallpox and dying, and Catherine is responding to something that another monarch is doing. So she's very canny, she's very quick at picking it up, but she's always balancing it very finely, the European and the Russianness.
Yeah. Another question, also kind of about these same problems of quality of connection. Interesting that Catherine, like those very finicky drawings, that not the many very fine paintings by Guéridou that were acquired for and sent to her. Was her taste in paintings very different from her taste in drawings?
So we don't know much about what she often says, oh, I didn't like this picture. And we know that she gives away large numbers of pictures. So she feels that people should have pictures. She doesn't describe them in detail, the ones that she has. She does mention them, and she does admire them, and she talks about admiring them, and she has a catalogue done of them. We know that there are some of the drawings were on display. Actually, said that there were a small number, mainly miniatures, but a few other drawings that were on display under glass in the Hermitage, including a drawing that's now in the Louvre by Raphael, or not by Raphael, was then thought to be by Raphael. It's always said, you know, the thing she has a real passion for is engraved gems. And one of the reasons for that is because she had a real passion for a young man who also liked engraved gems, and they collected together, and it reinforced her passion for the gems themselves. She certainly likes the paintings. I think she likes something big and impressive and lots of them on the wall, and she likes leafing through books of prints, but I don't think she likes little sketchy things. She doesn't see the point of that. She refers to her engraved gems. She says, we're going to put on a play. Let's look at we need some classical costumes. Let's look at my collection of engraved gems. We can get them costumes from there. She doesn't say, oh, look, I've got these drawings that I can get them. She just doesn't seem to pay them any attention. She has them because she ought to have them, but I don't think that she's bothered.
Okay. Did the Russian art agents in Paris and elsewhere have a particular advantage in obtaining these collections, or was there competition for acquiring them?
Well, Catherine was very clever, so she was associating with some of the biggest names in Enlightenment Europe. So in 1768, the Brou collection she bought in Germany. She had an agent, but he wasn't the most important person. Dolgorukov, he wasn't the most important person. He was simply sending stuff on. But he was facilitating. She'd been sent the catalogue and she said, this is what I want. In 1772, it's Diderot who says, I can get you the Crozar collection. Would you like the Crozar collection? I can do it for you. We have to remember that Diderot was writing the little books for the salon. He was Mr. Big in the art world. So was Falconet. So she had Falconet working for her in St. Petersburg. She bought Diderot's library. You know, she was corresponding with all the right people. But Baron Grimm, the man who wrote the cultural gossip letter that went round to courts of Europe. So yes, always had an advantage, but she also never, although she didn't want to spend too much, and she was quite fussy if she felt she'd spent too much, if she felt it was worth it. For instance, in 1779, she bought the collection formed by Britain's first Prime Minister, Sir Robert Walpole, 204 paintings, for a very high sum. But that was partly because, we don't know this, but it's a conclusion. There had been speeches in Parliament saying, we can't sell it abroad, it has to be saved for the nation. And so she said, yes, famous, formed by a famous man. And I can just say, I got that. And there she spent a lot of money. Generally speaking, she didn't like to spend too much, but she wasn't going to be cheap. So she was using the best agents. Yes. Amazing.
Another excellent question. Continuing the thread of architectural fascinations, Catherine was also highly enthusiastic of prints by Piranesi. How would you compare her practices of collecting prints and drawings?
Prints were functional. She saw their function. She knew what they were for. So she looked through them. I mean, it is a famous story that the Raphael lodges happened because she was leafing through the prints after the Raphael lodges in the Vatican and thought, I want one of those. And said, I need a man who can paint me a copy of this loggia from the Vatican. It was her picture magazine prints were. She didn't collect them. I think she simply loved looking at them in the way that you look at magazines, and she loved to return to them. And she had architectural projects. And while she didn't let her architectural projects in life take off and become too, beyond reality, in these architectural drawings, she could allow herself to imagine what she could do. So yes, she loves prints. I think she likes they're bigger, the particularly architectural prints. They're a proper size, whereas some of these drawings are very tiny. Those 4,000 drawings, not many of them are, some of them are this sort of size, but at least 50% are quite small. So.
And maybe I will take two more questions, and then they're related not to Catherine. First, is there a way to see these prints somewhere? Are they digitized or maybe available online anywhere?
So a lot of the drawings are on the site, not as many as we would like. There's also, for those of you who speak Russian, some drawings, but not many, are on the Catalogue site. It's a bit clunky, but you can sort of say drawings, Hermitage, whatever. The Hermitage's own website has much better images. And there's also a mirror site, an old mirror site, which is very easy to use, called Art Hermitage. And it says, choose your author, and you just choose the name and it all comes up. You can't do that on the very fancy Hermitage site. Unfortunately, 44,000 drawings, they're not all on there, I'm afraid. Even the 14,000 that were in the Hermitage before 1917 are not all on there. Work goes on. Work goes on.
And the final question along the lines of your last answer. So have ever been about the recent acquisitions and maybe acquisitions of drawings and returns?
Of drawings?
Drawings.
So,
in contemporary Russia, are museums...
They don't come up very often, but for instance, there was a big show of works by Jakob Jordans 2 years ago. Is it 2 years ago? Seems like just yesterday. which included some new purchases. So every so often, drawings come up and are offered. We have to fight, well, I don't work at the Hermitage, but the curator has to fight against other departments who also want to spend the acquisitions money. But there have been some fine acquisitions, I think, of Flemish drawings by Alexei Larionov, who will be speaking in November. I know in Moscow, they also keep an eye out and really try to buy what they can, but there is only limited acquisition funds. Very recently, there was a drawing presented by an art historian, herself the widow of a very famous British art historian, Frances Haskell. She bought a drawing at auction. She used to work in the Hermitage in the 60s. She bought a drawing at auction and presented it to the Hermitage, which was thought to be by the architect Giacomo Quarenghi. It's not, but it's a fascinating and very fine drawing. So there are gifts and the curators, so people know the curator, they know what they like, and they will come and offer. And then the Hermitage, like any museum, the curator has to fight other departments for the money to be spent on what they particularly want to acquire.
Well, thank you so much again, Katrin, for this fantastic lecture and amazing introduction to our project. Thank to the audience for sending excellent questions, and please stay tuned. The next lecture will be in October. We always meet on Thursdays at noon Eastern Time, or 7 p.m. or 8 p.m. In St. Petersburg in Russia. Thank you. We will conclude, and again, applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you.